What would you risk for a starving child who knocks at midnight your land, your life, or your soul? The lamp oil burned low in Thomas Cray's cabin as he counted fence staples like coins. 17 left in the tobacco tin, and winter still had teeth to show. The wind rattled the doorframe, carrying the scent of snow that hadn't fallen yet but would before morning. He set down his ledger and walked to the window. His breath fogged the glass as he peered into the darkness beyond his property line. The mortgage payment was due in 4 days, $37 he didn't have, not with the cattle prices fallen and his best breeding stock lost to the early freeze. A folded marriage paper lay beneath his coffee cup, yellowed at the edges. Mary's handwriting still clear after 3 years. "Promise me you'll keep the land, Thomas. It's all we have left of home." He'd kept the promise, but barely. The bankman would come Tuesday with foreclosure papers unless he found a miracle in his empty pockets. The knock came soft, almost lost in the wind's howl. Thomas lifted his rifle from its pegs and cracked the door. A girl stood on his porch, maybe 12 years old, her lips blue with cold and her coat thin as paper. She swayed on her feet, hollow-cheeked, eyes bright but unsteady. "Please, mister," she whispered, "I ain't eaten in 2 days." Thomas looked past her into the night. No horse, no wagon tracks. She'd walked here through miles of empty range. He opened the door wide. "Come in, child." The last loaf of bread sat on his table, baked 3 days ago with the dregs of his flour. His stomach had been growling since noon, but he cut the bread in half and set the larger piece before her with a cup of water. She ate without speaking, tears cutting tracks through the dirt on her face. "What's your name?" he asked. "Sarah Elk Runner." She looked up at him. "My papa sent me to find work. Said folks in town might need help." Thomas nodded, understanding more than she'd said. The reservation was 50 miles north, and winter was lean everywhere. He pulled a wool blanket from his bed and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You can sleep by the fire tonight. We'll figure the rest come morning." As the girl curled up near the hearth, Thomas stepped onto his porch and studied the horizon. Storm clouds gathered in the north, heavy with snow. Something else moved in the darkness beyond his fence line. Saddle-high shadows, too far off to count. He watched until his eyes watered from the cold, but the shapes had vanished into the night. Inside, he checked his rifle's load and set it within reach. The folded parchment crinkled as he creased it smaller and tucked it into his shirt pocket close to his heart. Dawn came grey and bitter, with snow falling in fat flakes that stuck to everything they touched. Thomas woke to find Sarah already awake, tending the fire with practiced hands. The blanket had slipped from her shoulders, revealing a torn dress and shoes held together with twine. "I can work," she said without preamble. "I know horses and cattle. I can mend and cook some." Thomas poured coffee from the pot and handed her a cup. "Where's your family, Sarah?" "Papa's sick with the lung fever. Mama's caring for him, and the little ones." She met his eyes steadily. "I wasn't lying about needing work, mister. I can earn my keep." Through the window, Thomas spotted riders on the ridge, dark figures against the snow. Too many to count from this distance, but more than he'd ever seen together on his land. They sat motionless, like they were waiting for something. "How many folks know you came here?" he asked. Sarah shrugged. "Told the clerk at Henderson's store I was looking for work. Asked about ranchers who might need help." She paused. "He said you were decent, but had troubles of your own." Thomas set down his cup harder than he'd intended. Henderson's store sat at the crossroads, where every piece of gossip in 3 counties gathered like dust in a corner. If word had spread that he'd taken in a native girl, alone and without family protection. A horse whinnied outside, close to the house. Thomas grabbed his rifle and peered through the curtain. A single rider approached under a white flag Jake Morrison, the bank representative, his black coat stark against the snow. "Stay inside," Thomas told Sarah. "Whatever happens, don't come out unless I call for you." He stepped onto the porch, rifle held loose but ready. Morrison reined up 20 feet away, his horse stamping and blowing steam. "Morning, Cray." Morrison's voice carried no warmth. "Heard you got yourself a visitor." "Might be I do." Thomas kept his tone level. "That your business now, Jake." Morrison's eyes flicked toward the ridgeline, where the dark shapes had multiplied. Thomas could see them clearly, now dozens of riders arranged in a loose semicircle around his property. Some wore badges. Others didn't need them. "Banks called in your note early," Morrison said, pulling a folded document from his coat. "Payment due today, in full, $37 plus interest, 42 total." Thomas felt the marriage paper crinkle against his chest. "Note says Tuesday." Morrison's smile was thin as a knife blade. "Tuesday don't matter anymore. The bank's just bought up the grazing tract south of here. Without your water rights, that land's worth dust. With them, it's worth a fortune. President decided, we can't wait, especially not while you're housing questionable company." The wind picked up, driving snow across the yard in small whirlwinds. Thomas counted the riders. He could see at least 60, maybe more hidden in the trees, all waiting for his answer. "Give me till noon," he said. Morrison shook his head. "Afraid not. You got 1 hour to pay or clear out, both you and your guest." His emphasis on the last word made it sound like something dirty. As Morrison rode away, Thomas looked up at the riders on the ridge. They hadn't moved, but their message was clear as winter air. He had 1 hour to find $42, or lose everything he'd promised Mary he'd keep. Inside, Sarah stood by the window, her young face pale but determined. "I should go," she said quietly. "I don't want to bring you trouble." Thomas looked at the marriage paper in his hands, then at the girl who'd walked 50 miles through a storm looking for honest work. Some choices came with a price you couldn't calculate in dollars. "No," he said, folding the paper carefully and placing it on the table between them. "You're not going anywhere." Thomas sat at his table, the marriage paper spread flat before him. Mary's script filled both sides, boundaries, pasture counts, water rights, even mineral notes, things he'd buried under grief. At the bottom, in a hand, smaller but steady, she had written, "Thomas Cray holds sole mining and water rights to all surveyed territory, as witnessed by U.S. Marshal Bass Reeves, 1,887. Sarah stirred broth at the stove, her voice calm. "Papa taught me to read contracts. That's no goodbye letter. It's a record, formal date, detailed description, and a federal witness. In law, that makes it binding." Thomas bent closer, the ink seeming sharper than it had in years. He remembered Reeves stopping by, Mary pouring coffee, her quiet insistence on proper signatures. The memory struck him like a door unlocking in his chest. Through the window, the riders had pressed nearer, Morrison speaking with a man in a marshal's coat. Snow gusted harder, the cabin rattling with every gust. Sarah set a bowl in front of him. "Eat, you'll need strength." He tasted the thin broth and, for the first time in years, something warmer than grief hope. "The bank can take walls and fences," he said slowly, "but not federally witnessed water and minerals." Sarah nodded. "And without those, their new tract is worth nothing. They'll have to come to you." A new knock came at the door, not Morrison this time. but the territorial marshal himself. Thomas folded the marriage paper and tucked it into his shirt pocket, feeling its weight differently now. Not just a keepsake, but a weapon Mary had left him. "Time to find out what we're really fighting for," he said. Sarah stepped beside him, still holding her wooden spoon like a small sword. "We?" she asked. Thomas looked down at the girl who'd walked 50 miles through a storm, and then showed him the hidden strength in his own wife's final gift. Some alliances were forged in fire, others in simple acts of shared courage. "We," he said, and opened the door. The territorial marshal was a compact man with steel-grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. He introduced himself as Marshal Eli Harrow, and unlike Morrison, he stayed mounted, keeping formal distance. "Mr. Cray," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm here about a territorial boundary dispute. Seems there's question about your water and mineral rights." Thomas pulled the marriage paper from his pocket and held it up so Harrow could see the official witness signature. "No dispute, Marshal. Bass Reeves witnessed this claim 3 years ago. Everything's in order under territorial law." Harrow leaned forward in his saddle, studying the document. His expression shifted slightly professional interest, replacing bureaucratic routine. "Mind if I examine that paper?" Thomas walked closer and handed it up. Harrow unfolded it carefully, reading both sides with the attention of a man who knew legal documents. Behind him, Morrison sat his horse with growing agitation. "This is highly irregular," Morrison called out. "The bank's claim takes precedence over any personal papers." Harrow ignored him, continuing to read. After a long moment, he refolded the paper and handed it back to Thomas. "It's valid. Federal witness. Complete description. Your water and mineral rights stand. Now," Marshal Morrison's voice rose, "the bank has legitimate foreclosure papers." "The bank has claimed to ranch improvements and grazing rights," Harrow interrupted. "Not to federally witnessed mineral claims. 2 different jurisdictions, Mr. Morrison." Thomas felt the marriage paper's weight in his pocket like Mary's hand on his shoulder. She'd known this day would come and prepared for it with a lawyer's precision hidden in a wife's final letter. Sarah appeared in the doorway behind him, carrying 2 steaming cups. She offered one to Marshal Henry, who accepted it with a surprised nod of thanks. "Miss," he said politely, then looked back at Thomas, "I understand there's been some community concern about your hospitality choices." "Girl needed help," Thomas said simply. "I gave it." Harrow sipped the coffee and studied the riders arranged on the ridgeline. Thomas followed his gaze, counting at least 80 men now, some wearing badges, others clearly not official law. "Lot of concerned citizens," Harrow observed dryly. "Lot of folks with opinions about things that ain't their business," Thomas replied. Marshal Harrow finished his coffee and handed the cup back to Sarah with a courteous tip of his hat. "Miss, that's fine coffee. Thank you kindly." He turned his attention back to Thomas. "Mr. Cray, your mineral rights are valid under federal law. However, I'm obligated to inform you that the community has expressed safety concerns about harboring unaccompanied minors from the reservation." Morrison leaned forward eagerly. "Exactly what I've been saying, which is why," Harrow continued smoothly, "I'll be filing a report with the territorial governor requesting official guardian status be granted to Mr. Cray, pending resolution of the child's family situation, under federal protection." The silence stretched like a held breath. Thomas felt something fundamental shift in the air around them. Mary's legal foresight had given him the weapon. Sarah's courage had given him the reason to use it. Federal protection? Morrison's voice cracked slightly. Miss Sarah Elk Runner is now under territorial custody, legally placed with Mr. Cray as guardian. Henry's voice carried absolute authority. Any interference with that arrangement would be a federal offence. On the ridgeline, some of the riders began to shift restlessly. The nature of their gathering had just changed from community pressure to potential federal crime. Thomas looked down at Sarah, who stood straighter now, her chin raised with quiet dignity. "What do you say, Sarah? You willing to stay on as my ward, legal and proper?" "Yes, sir," she said clearly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'd be honored." Marshal Harrow nodded once. Then it's settled. "Mr. Morrison, you can serve your foreclosure papers if you've a mind to, but they only apply to ranch structures. The mineral and water rights stay with Mr. Cray, and Miss Sarah stays under his legal protection." As Harrow rode away, Morrison sat his horse for a long moment, staring at the marriage paper in Thomas's hands. Finally, he wheeled his mount around and galloped toward the ridge, where the crowd of riders had begun to disperse like smoke in wind. Thomas felt Sarah's small hand slip into his. The marriage paper rustled against his heart, and for the first time in 3 years he felt Mary's presence not as a ghost of grief, but as a living gift of strength. The real test would come with darkness, when official eyes were turned away and community anger found its own justice. But for now, they had law on their side and each other for courage. It would have to be enough. By sunset, only 20 riders remained on the ridge, but Thomas knew these were the dangerous ones, men who cared more about their version of right than about territorial law. He'd seen their kind before. Faces set hard as winter ground, convinced their cause justified any action. Sarah helped him secure the cabin, checking window latches and door bars with the practical efficiency of someone who'd learned caution early. She'd changed from the hollow-cheeked waif of yesterday into something stronger, still a child, but one tempered by necessity. "They'll come after midnight," she said matter-of-factly, pressing her ear to the door, "when decent folks are asleep and won't see what happens." Thomas loaded his rifle and set extra ammunition on the table beside Mary's marriage paper. The document had saved them once today, but paper couldn't stop bullets or fire. "Sarah," he said carefully, "there's a root cellar behind the house. If things go bad—" "No." Her voice was quiet but absolute. "If we run, they win. If they burn us out, they win. The only way we don't lose is if we stand." Thomas looked at her, really looked, and saw something that reminded him of Mary in her final days. Not the weakness of illness, but the fierce strength that came from knowing exactly what mattered and refusing to compromise on it. "Then we stand," he said. The attack came at 2 in the morning, announced by the smell of coal oil and the soft whinny of horses moving in practice formation. Thomas peered through the window and counted 15 men dismounting in his yard, several carrying torches, others with rifles. Jake Morrison stood in their centre, no longer the polite bank representative, but something harder and more desperate. His voice carried clearly in the cold air. "Cray, send the girl out and we'll let you keep your cabin. This is your last chance to do right by your community." Thomas stepped onto his porch, rifle in hand, Sarah beside him with a wooden bucket of water, her own quiet act of defiance. The marriage paper crinkled in his pocket as he straightened to his full height. "Community?" he called back. "I see a bunch of men with torches on my property at 2 in the morning. Don't look much like community to me." Morrison raised his own rifle. "That girl don't belong here, Cray. Send her back where she came from, and we'll call this square." "She belongs wherever she chooses to be," Thomas replied. And she chooses to stay. A shot cracked from the dark. A porch post splintered. The wire went taut. 15 men with guns and fire against a rancher and a child with one rifle and a bucket of water. The mathematics were simple and stark. Then Sarah stepped forward, her voice carrying with surprising strength across the yard. "My name is Sarah Elkrunner. I'm 12 years old, and I walked 50 miles through a storm looking for honest work. Mr. Cray gave me food when I was hungry and shelter when I was cold. If that makes him a bad man in your eyes, then your eyes see wrong." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Several of the men shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering their own children safe in warm beds. Morrison raised his rifle higher. "That water runs south, Cray. The bank paid dear for that tracked hand over the girl and the trouble, and we all sleep warm. Pretty speech, girl, but you're still going back where—" The shot came from the ridge, sharp and commanding. Marshal Eli Harrow's voice followed it, amplified by a speaking trumpet. "Federal marshals, drop your weapons and disperse immediately. This property is under territorial protection." Torches began appearing along the ridgeline, not the scattered few Thomas had expected, but dozens, carried by uniformed men moving with military precision. Harrow had returned with a full federal detail. Morrison's rifle wavered. Around him, his men began looking toward their horses with increasing urgency. What had seemed like righteous community action moments before now looked like armed insurrection against federal authority. "This ain't over, Cray," Morrison called, but his retreat had already begun. Within minutes, the yard was empty except for the acrid smell of extinguished torches. Thomas and Sarah stood on their porch, still holding rifle and bucket, watching the last of the riders disappear into the darkness. Marshal Harrow approached on foot, his badge glinting in the lamplight. "All secure, Mr. Cray. My men will maintain a presence for the next few days. Make sure everyone understands the new arrangement." Thomas felt the marriage paper against his heart, Mary's final gift, having saved not just his land, but his life. "Marshal, I can't thank you enough." Harrow held up a hand. "Don't thank me yet. Come Tuesday, you'll still owe the bank $42, federal mineral rights or not. I can't help you with that." Thomas smiled for the first time in 3 years, pulling the marriage paper from his pocket and unfolding it to the section Sarah had shown him that morning. Hidden in Mary's careful script was one more gift. "Marshal, what would you say this property's water rights are worth to a bank that needs them to make their foreclosed land valuable?" Harrow examined the document again, his expression shifting as understanding dawned. "I'd say about $42, Mr. Cray. Maybe a bit more." Sarah grinned beside him, and Thomas felt Mary's presence settle around them like a warm blanket. His wife had left him not just legal protection, but the means to turn defense into victory. Come Tuesday, he'd walk into Morrison's bank with a counter-proposal. They could have the ranch structures for $42, but the water rights would cost them considerably more. Or they could tear up the foreclosure papers and accept a new partnership arrangement. Either way, he and Sarah would still be here when spring came, and the land Mary had made him promise to keep would stay in his hands where it belonged. 3 months later, Thomas stood in his rebuilt barn, watching Sarah teach a yearling colt to accept a lead rope. The bank had accepted his counter-proposal after a week of heated negotiations, making him a junior partner in a new ranching venture that utilized his water rights and their capital. The marriage paper now hung framed in the cabin, Mary's handwriting a daily reminder that love could reach across death to protect what mattered most. Next to it hung Sarah's official adoption papers, signed by territorial authorities and witnessed by Marshal Harrow himself. Sarah had grown 3 inches, and put on 15 pounds of healthy weight. Her laughter filled spaces in the cabin that had been silent too long, and her practical wisdom continued to amaze him daily. She'd proven as capable with cattle as she'd claimed, but more than that, she'd brought life back to a place that had been slowly dying of loneliness. "Uncle Thomas," she called, using the title they'd settled on. "You want to see something?" She led him to the back corner of the barn, where she'd been working on a project during the long winter evenings. A wooden sign hung there, freshly painted in careful letters, Cray and Elk Runner Ranch. Established 1,890 partners in all things. Thomas felt his throat tighten with an emotion that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite joy, but something deeper and more lasting. "Mary would have liked you," he said quietly. Sarah smiled, still holding the colt's lead rope. "I think I would have liked her too. From everything you've told me, she was a woman who saw what needed doing and did it." The morning sun slanted through the barn doors, warming their faces as they stood together, looking at their shared future painted in black letters on white wood. Outside, cattle moved across pastures made green by water rights Mary had protected, and Sarah had helped him understand. Some gifts took years to unwrap completely. Some partnerships were forged in crisis but built in daily choice, and sometimes the quiet rancher who shared his last loaf with a freezing girl discovered that generosity multiplied returned more than it cost. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.